Good evening and welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. This evening's show is part of our Legislative Issues series hosted by Jim Parisi. I'm Bob Delaney, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance to working Rhode Islanders. We hope you enjoy this evening's edition.
Welcome to this week's edition of Labor Vision, where we bring the General Assembly into your living room. My name is James Parisi. I'm a field representative with the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and Health Professionals, and I'm your host this evening. Today we're going to focus on an important issue. It is the union's response to the legislative package submitted by Governor Lincoln Chafee related to his municipal relief plan. With us we have two gentlemen who waged the fight against the plan. Paul Valletta. Paul, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Paul is a legislative agent with the Rhode Island State Association of Firefighters and is a Cranston firefighter. Right. And also joining us is Tony Capezza. Tony, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jim.
You work for the International Brotherhood of Police Officers and you're a retired Cranston cop, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Before we talk about what you did against the Chafee legislative package and what the package contained in the first place, let's get a little bit of background. Tony, let's start with you. Who does the IBPO represent here in the state of Rhode Island?
The International Brotherhood of Police Officers represents 28 of the 38 municipalities in the state. We also represent the DOD police at Newport, and we have service agreements to service the police officers at RISD and Roger Williams University.
About how many members do you have in Rhode Island?
Roughly 1,400.
Okay. And how long have you been involved with the IBPO, either as a staff person or as an elected person? I've
been involved with the IBPO since 1977, 78. I sat on the National Council, which was a 6-person council that made policy for the IBPO throughout the country. When I retired from the police department, January '96, I was given a job by the IBPO as a national representative. I held that position till 2002 when I became the state director for NAGE IBPO in the state of Rhode Island.
And part of your duties and responsibilities is to work on legislative issues on behalf of the union?
Myself and one of my reps, Ralph Izowski, we handle the legislative package each year.
Okay. And what were your legislative priorities this year, other than the Chafee municipal package, or was that pretty much it?
This year was a very small priority list that we had. Besides the Chafee package bill, one of our main priorities was, as you know, when they passed the pension reform bill for the MERS system, police officers and firemen were required to work until age 55. For various reasons that we testified numerous times, both myself and Paul, before the General Assembly, we put legislation in to try to get that age 55 removed. As you know, because you were at those hearings, our main objection to it was the older a police officer or a firefighter is on the job, the more chance there is that he's going to be injured or suffer a heart attack. We didn't want to see that happen. As you know, part of that legislation, the age 55 was removed for state police, which we wholeheartedly agree with because we don't believe they should be working until 55 either. What we couldn't understand is how the General Assembly saw it fit that age 55 was too old for one group, but wasn't too old for another group of police officers. So we made that our main priority, to try to get it removed. Unfortunately, we didn't.
Unfinished business, something you'll probably look at next session.
It's something that will be back.
Good. Paul, I know you've been on the show, but why don't you give our viewers a quick rundown on your job title, who the State Association of Firefighters represents here in Rhode Island?
Okay, sure. I represent the 32 of the 33 unionized fire departments in the state. They're part of the Rhode Island State Association of Firefighters, or RISAF as we call it. I've been with RISAF as their legislative agent for 3 years now. Prior to that, I would go up to the State House and bother the agent at the time, Tom Papa, and that's how I learned, following Tom around. But I've been up there for 3 years now. I'm also a active Cranston firefighter. I've been a firefighter for 28 years. I'm presently serving on a ladder company as a captain. And I think it gives us a perspective, Tony and I, a perspective of, a different perspective when we go up there, when we talk police and fire issues, because we've actually, Tony's done the job and I'm still doing the job. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a big difference. And I think we're listened to up there because of that reason. So that's basically what I do up there. I represent the men and women of the Rhode Island Fire Service.
Yeah. How long have you been a firefighter?
28 years I've been in Cranston.
Yeah, it's a good amount of time.
Yeah.
And you're also an officer of your local union?
I am an officer. I've been an elected official of my local for 27 of my 28 years. I was fortunately to get elected in my first year on the job, and I've been an elected official since then, and I've had the honor to serve as the president of the local for the last 10 years. So it keeps me involved in a lot of things, especially using that up at the State House.
Mm-hmm. Tony, before we get on to the matter at hand, the Chafee package, how long were you an active police officer in Cranston?
23 years. Mm-hmm. And out of those 23 years, I served on the executive board for 16 of them. I started off as treasurer and immediately ran for election for president after that. And after 4 terms of president, I stepped down and took a lower position as a 2-year trustee, and then more or less went into retirement until I actually retired and let some of the younger people move up.
Terrific.
Yeah.
So we're going to show a slide on the screen, which is some summary of the Chafee legislative package from the governor's own press office. We won't take ownership of the wording on it, but it starts with a proposal to allow municipalities with poorly funded pension plans to suspend the annual cost of living increases. He also offered a proposal to make certain changes to highly distressed communities. And although the definition of who is or who isn't a highly distressed community would change from year to year, for this past year it would have been Providence, Pawtucket, Woonsocket, and West Warwick. And it was interesting that his own press statement noted that cities and towns have lost over $220 million of state aid in the last 3 years. This was his response to that. It was, but it would basically change worker rights and change your binding arbitration statute. He had a couple of different measures related to school budgets and what would happen with school budgets, I think, in response to some, last second or seemingly last second budget deficits from some pretty big school departments here in the state of Rhode Island. In addition to the COLA suspension, he also proposed some other changes to the privately operated pensions as far as the pension benefits, and had some other provisions related to the flow of state money. So Paul, let me start with you, and if you could just do a quick review for our viewers. We had a big pension reform package that was pushed by Gina Raimondo and passed last fall. That affected some municipal pension plans, including some public safety plans. Describe who those folks who've already been affected, and then what's left that were dealt with the Chafee package.
Sure. In the Rhode Island State Association of Firefighters, we're actually split right down the middle. 15 are in the private plan. They have their own private plan, which is Cranston's part of it, which means the municipalities run the pension plan. And the other half of the firefighters in RISAF, the other departments, they're part of the state pension plan. Cranston's unique. They have firefighters both in the private and the state pension plan. But that's where RISAF is. We have half in private and half in the state. The plans did take away pension benefits for the state firefighters. Now, we don't agree with what took place then, and we certainly don't agree what's trying to be done with the Chafee package to the private pension plans. We're confident. I believe that when this plays out in court with the state end of it, I believe there's going to be some changes made. I believe the courts are going to uphold what was part of the state statute. And then when you go to the private plans, which the governor had put in, and it was any pension plan that was 60% funded or less, which I can talk personally about because Cranston is the second worst funded pension in the state of Rhode Island at 16. So I've been living this for the last 28 years. And the issue is with the private pension plans is that many of them are funded less than 60%. So many of the fire pension plans will lose their COLA right away. Now, it was estimated, and I'll stick with Cranston as not to talk about everyone because I'm intimate knowledge of Cranston. It was estimated that by the governor's plan, even with the suspension of the COLA, that Cranston's plan would take 22 years to get up to 60% funded. And then the question was never answered, which we asked, well, say this pension, the COLA is suspended for those 22 years. Now, when we get up to 60% in 22 years, when you add that COLA back in that we're going to get now, does it drop the pension back down to underfunded? And the answer would be yes, but it was never told to us that you know, they'd have to go more years out after the 22. So basically what I'm trying to say is if the Chafee package had passed, Cranston firefighters in the private pension probably wouldn't see a COLA for 25 to 30 years.
I know the changes that Gina Raimondo pushed through that affected teachers and state workers and half of the state's firefighters in the MERS plans, the Municipal Employee Retirement System plans. It didn't actually get rid of the COLA, it suspended it, and it allowed a COLA every 5 years, but only if the stock market performs well, and even that COLA is a cap. It's really not a COLA anymore, even in that state plan, because it's a small amount of money, comes nowhere close to meeting the inflation rate that we've experienced in the past. Did the Chafee package have that kind of stock market COLA change, or was it a suspension?
No, the Chafee plan, it was a suspension, and then when it did come back, when you reached 60% or more funded, when it did come back, then it would mirror the state. You know, the difference with firefighters is that, you know, our pensions, the older guys, our pensions, I don't pay into Social Security. That was a decision the city of Cranston made when I came on the job. They didn't want to pay their half. They saved that money paying their half of my Social Security. So in Cranston, our pensions, that's it. And everybody gets a cost of living adjustment, but we wouldn't have one in Cranston.
Yeah, and of course Social Security still has a COLA, where these state plans and now these municipal plans don't. Tony, you joined the Firefighters Association in opposition to this proposal, I imagine?
We did, and I think it should be mentioned that Paul and myself, we work very closely together, and we work very well together. Besides being co-workers, we're also friends. And I can say that I will support anything that the firefighters are against and vice versa, because it's not really police officers and firefighters. It's public safety, period. That's what it is. So we joined our opposition to these bills wholeheartedly. And there's one thing, you know, that I do want to clarify, what Paul had mentioned. On some of these bills that Chafee had put in, when it came to the COLAs, they were suspended, and they were suspended until the plan was 60% funded. And then, even if it came back, it was going to be what the CPI was, not what it originally was. And our whole crust of the arguments against these plans were basically whether when we were arguing the MERS system or we're arguing the private systems. It was all contractual, unlike other municipal employees. And you have to keep in mind also, when this MERS system was being discussed. We were told constantly that police and fire were not involved in it. That particular year, the general treasurer was looking at school teachers and state employees. At the 11th hour, when we could not prepare an accurate, defense against it, we found out that we were included. So we're at a distinct disadvantage there on preparing on that.
I know the statute for teachers and state workers specifically excludes pensions from the bargaining law. In other words, we can't bargain pensions in the teacher world, and neither can state workers. But police and fire, you do bargain pensions, and you do have contract provisions in most or all of your contracts?
Almost all our MERS system contracts. Even though it's covered by statute, okay, the contracts dictate what the benefits were, because almost all these pensions at one time, especially the smaller departments we represent, were private pensions, and then decided to join the MERS system. So the benefits had to be negotiated prior to doing that. Well, as a result of the negotiations, the language also ended up in the contract. So like Paul mentioned earlier, we're confident that the courts are going to overturn, what the General Assembly did on the MERS system.
I would imagine, in addition to teachers and state workers having a recognized implied contract for their pensions, you have an even stronger argument, because you can point to specific clauses in your contracts that cover these pension benefits, right?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I know the court ruling isn't final yet, but one of the court rulings was that there was an implied contract with the state statute. There's nothing implied about ours. It's in black and white. And one of the issues we take with this Governor Chafee language when he was going into the private pensions is the people that created the mess, the cities and towns, they get off scot-free on this thing. You're passing legislation that just does away with collective bargaining, does away with contract language. Now, and I witnessed it during the general treasurer when she put her show on. I witnessed the teachers, I witnessed the state workers, all saying, let us be part of the solution. We can fix this together. And they were ignored. And just like we're being ignored now. We look at Cranston, we got a $311 million unfunded liability. We're willing to sit down at the table and discuss that and try and fix the problem. But this legislation, they just try and do it legislatively. And there was no input from anybody. And again, the people that created the problem, the ones that never funded it, which were the cities and towns, they get off scot-free on this thing. So there has to be a balance here.
So both of you would recognize that there are some problems with these privately operated pensions that need to be fixed.
Yeah, when you're talking at Cranston being 16% underfunded, Coventry is 15% underfunded, you have to open up the dialogue. There has to be some open dialogue. You have to get by, which we have. We've gotten by that. It wasn't our fault. They just never funded it. We've gotten by that. Even though in the 70s, the police and fire took the city of Cranston to court, because we realized in the 70s that when they weren't funding the pension, that at some point when people start to retire, there's going to be a problem because you're not funding it. Unfortunately, the judge ruled against us, and if that judge had ruled that they have to fund it, we'd never be in the position we're in now.
And we're still in that position, and even this past year, there have been mayors and councils that have not made their 100% required contribution to these privately operated pension funds, making the matter worse, not better.
It's an excellent point. My mayor in Cranston, who has been leading the charge, he's been the main cheerleader of these pension changes, and tomorrow night, as a matter, we have a finance meeting in the city of Cranston that they're going to try and change our fire police pension by ordinance instead of negotiating it. We didn't have a tax increase this year in Cranston, and you know what? I'm glad there was no tax increase, but the pension was funded at 85%. So he's done exactly what the other people have done, the other people in charge of the city have done. Because it's an election year, we won't raise taxes, but we'll underfund the pension that we know is already drastically underfunded.
Sure. I know we could probably talk for an hour about pension COLAs, but let's take a few minutes and talk about some other aspects of the governor's package. Another high prominent issue was the governor proposing to change the rules on binding arbitration and other so-called mandates in these highly distressed communities. Tony, that was another prominent issue that he pushed. What was your union's response to the Chafee municipal package as it related to highly distressed communities?
That was another bill that we opposed vigorously through testimony, through our members, contacting legislators to express their opinion on why this should not change. You know, when this was all going down, the only thing I could think of was I was looking at another Scott Walker. I said, this is Wisconsin all over, and I mentioned that to Paul several times. As a matter of fact, I mentioned it in testimony in front of the House Finance Committee. Workers' rights are in place for a reason. You know, if employers treated employees way back as human beings, there would have never been unions. There's a reason why unions are there, and they're there to protect their members and to see that they get a fair wage for a fair day's work. This governor wants to change all that, and I oppose that. Binding arbitration works. As you know, police and fire have binding arbitration for all matters. And the reason why the Arbitration Act was written the way it did was because the General Assembly at the time realized that they could not have labor unrest with their emergency service personnel. I mean, how would a municipality operate if their fire department and police department were allowed to strike? Okay? I mean, you're jeopardizing the lives of citizens. So in lieu of the right to strike, we got binding arbitration for all matters. And if you listen to the town managers and you listen to the governor and you listen to the mayors, binding arbitration is one-sided. It's all towards the unions. And recently, the governor was at a council meeting in East Providence, and this was before the end of the session, and he was toting his bills and trying to get the councils to pass resolutions in support of his bills. And he got on the binding arbitration and why binding arbitration does not work. Well, one of my reps who represents East Providence, Ralph Ozowski, was at that meeting. And he stood up and asked the governor a question. And he asked him, he said, Governor, he said, name one incident in the last decade where binding arbitration hurt a municipality. And the governor could not come up with one case. In recent arbitration awards, and I'll let Paul speak for it because he knows better than anybody what kind of awards he got in interest arbitration in the past few years. And they have not benefited the unions. It's benefited the municipalities. It's just a fabrication they're putting out there. They want to make binding arbitration the root of all evil when it comes to contracts for police and fire. And again, all I can relate this to is Wisconsin. That's all that keeps coming to mind.
Sure. Paul, just so our viewers have a good understanding, what exactly did Chafee propose to do to your binding arbitration law, and why did you oppose it?
Well, if it was passed, it would list cities and towns as distressed communities. Once you were listed as a distressed community, and that was part of the problem, that they lightened the definition of what a distressed community was. So basically, if a city or town walked in and said, I'm distressed, then you're distressed. And this law would kick in, and your contracts and binding arbitration would be out the window. The other issue we took was that once you declared you were a distressed community, you stayed a distressed community for 2 years. So you could say I'm a distressed community, and 3 months later, you know, like Cranston has a $12 million budget, you know, has a surplus. But if they declared a distressed community, and 3 months later they said, okay, we're all set now, then that distressed community would stay in place for 2 more years. So it was really just a way to get into our collective bargaining agreements. And you know, I could talk about this for a while too, but the main issue I would say was this: staffing, which is very important to police, to firefighters. Police officers, I don't believe, have minimum staffing, although they should, because I've seen when Cranston hits the road with 4 cars or 6 cars, and that's nowhere near enough. But anyways, the firefighters and police officers have to have a say in their safety when it comes to bargaining. And that's one of the pet peeves of the leagues of cities and towns, is that staffing should be a management right. No, it shouldn't be. The people that you're asking to do these jobs, police officers and firefighters, they have got to have a seat at the table when it comes to their safety. And quickly, what people don't know is we don't fall under, police and fire does not fall under national safety rules. So our collective bargaining agreements, when we talk about the equipment they have to buy us, our staffing, those are our safety. That's for our safety.
Yeah. I know that the manning in your contracts also is good not only for your firefighters, but also for the community. That it's good for the community that you have adequate staffing on your apparatus. And I have to say, I was particularly appalled with the governor's proposals related to public schools, because he was going to stop teacher step increases, get rid of school nurse teachers, get rid of bus monitors, but only in the highly distressed communities. And why should kids who go to the schools in these poor urban areas have less protection, less services than the rest of the state of Rhode Island? I just found it absolutely appalling.
We sit through all the hearings. Even if it doesn't concern us, we sit through them, because that's how you learn things. And that was one of my things when the bus monitors came up, and someone got up there and testified that the last child to get killed was, I think, in 1982 or 92. But so you've got a track record here. You've got a track record that not one child has been killed that had a bus monitor on it, and you're actually, to save a few dollars, you're actually thinking of getting rid of bus monitors. And that was the thing, in a distressed community. What difference does that make if it's distressed? It just boggles the mind sometimes what they're thinking.
Sure. Tony, why don't we move on to another area? I know that there were some other pension proposals in the Chafee package, including some dealing with accidental disability. Could you describe to our viewers what Chafee proposed and what was your response?
Okay, currently under the statute and contractually, because again, this is in all our contracts, or most of our contracts. Right now, if a police officer is injured in the line of duty and he goes out on a disability pension, his pension is 66 2/3 tax-free. The legislation that was submitted by the governor was that if a police officer became disabled and was totally disabled from performing any functions, he would continue to receive the 66 2/3. If he was totally disabled from doing police work, but not disabled from doing something else, his pension would then be a 50% pension. We oppose this, and the reason why we oppose this is when you look at police officers and firefighters, we are in extremely high-risk jobs and a high injury-causing job. As you know, police officers usually have to arrest people that don't want to be arrested, and many, many times they resist that arrest. Well, you get a lot of injuries when you end up in a wrestling match on the street, and especially in smaller departments where, you know, it could be one officer out there handling that arrest, and he's got no backup because there's only one other car on the road, and that car is tied up. So you get the injuries. And the way we looked at it was, you know, anybody can do another job, but you were trained to be a police officer. That was what you chose as a career. The job the police and fire were performing it for the community that they worked for. And when we take the job, we know there's a possibility that you're going to be injured. Many officers and firefighters are injured and never get pensions. I myself broke my hand, it's my right hand, and I'm right-handed twice. And the second time was broken. Doctors told me after they put it back together with wire, you break it again and you're going to lose the use of it. Mm-hmm. Well, I chose to continue working and just being extra careful with that right hand. I never went out on a disability pension. But we do have people who can't work. as a police officer. And we felt if they were injured in the line of duty, they were entitled to that 66 2/3, not the 50%, regardless of whether they were able to work or not work, because their chosen profession was to be a police officer or a firefighter, not a greeter somewhere. So
Sure, that makes perfect sense. Paul, we only have a couple of minutes left, but I
need
know
2 hours on this one, Jim.
I know. I know you care passionately about this issue, but
then I'll just say this: you can't ask people to become police officers and firefighters, knowing what the job is. You cannot ask them to take that job and not protect them and their family if they get injured or killed in the line of duty. You just can't. So,
well said and sustained. So at the end of the day, what did the General Assembly do with the Chafee package, Paul?
They didn't accept it. I think a lot of it had to do with they were told it would be illegal to break contracts by this law. We had people that supported us that probably never would give us the time of day, but I believe everybody got the opinions, the legal opinions, that there was no way out of this. If you break contracts by using this Chafee law, then in 2-3 years, we're going to have a big problem. And I think on the disability end of it, though, I think people, I really believe that for the most part, the people up in that house up there on the hill, they're good people, and I do believe they respect what police officers and firefighters do. When it came to the disability, we were able to give them what we know. We were able to give them statistics. And at the end of the day, they supported us on the disability. They respect what we do and think we should be taken care of if we're injured or killed in the line of duty.
Sure. Tony, in the last couple of seconds, you anticipate this issue coming back next session?
I'm pretty sure that every one of the bills will come back. They may be tweaked a little, but I'm sure we will see them again.
Okay. Well, perhaps we'll have you back on the show in the springtime so you can tell us if it did come back and what you were all doing about it. I certainly appreciate your time. And I thank you all for joining us for this session of the Labor Vision, where we focused on the State House issues.
Good evening and welcome to Labor Vision and the latest installment of our look at the history of working people and their unions and immigrants throughout American history. And whenever we can, we'll throw in a little of Rhode Island background as well. So thank you for joining us. My name's Scott Molloy. I'm a professor at the University of Rhode Island, and I've been teaching this for more than a quarter of a century. Last time we got together, we talked about the unbelievable industrial workers of the world, the IWW, more informally known as the Wobblies. And we saw how they took everyone in, regardless of skill, background, ethnicity, race, gender, anything else. They were all inclusive. And they were very militant and very radical and offered a very different vision of what the labor movement could be when compared and contrasted to Sam Gomper's AF of L. And we saw last time that in 1912, the IWW reached the peak of its power in 1912 at a strike just down the road from Rhode Island in Lawrence, Massachusetts, where the Bread and Roses strike pitted thousands of immigrant workers against the American Wool Company. And when it was all said and done, after a couple of months, the IWW had pulled off one of the greatest and unusual victories in all of American labor history. Unfortunately for them, sometimes victory comes with its own price. And although they had caught management off guard on innumerable occasions, after the publicity and the public relations surrounding the Bread and Roses strike in 1912, wherever the Wobblies went after that, it seemed that the authorities and the management were waiting for them. They now sort of expected what was to come. And so the IWW moved on, indeed, from Massachusetts to New Jersey, to the silk mills in places like Passaic and Paterson. But unfortunately for them, they got involved in a 5-month strike in that area, and in which case the employers were actually waiting for them and had hired extra guards, extra police, and eventually beat the IWW after a long and arduous struggle. And although the Wobblies didn't die a death at that particular point, it was the beginning of the end for them. And we'll see that the events of World War I will really put a stake in their heart. But I might add, by the way, if you ever do go to New Jersey, or if you know that state very well, often compared to Rhode Island in many ways because of the demographics and makeup of it. If you know where Haledon, New Jersey is, there's actually the American Labor Museum there, which in many ways is a shrine to the IWW. It's at a place called Haledon House, and Bartow House, excuse me, in Haledon. And you can see all sorts of material there. So if you're ever in that area, look it up. It's well worth a visit. Now, in looking at the history of the IWW, they did some rather unusual things, which were off the beaten path, so to speak. In fact, many of their tactics or their strategic look at the workplace would find fruition, not in their own day, but a generation later during the 1930s with the advent of the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organization, led by John L. Lewis. But we'll look at that later on. But it's interesting to see that sometimes you can get too far ahead of yourself, that your tactics are so brilliant, so new on the block, that you get ahead of everyone else, and it really backfires on you. They had a little success with it, obviously, at first, but eventually it fell down. But they tried to use people in the new mass sense of work. We saw the establishment of the assembly line. We see in the early 1900s Henry Ford putting in the moving assembly line in the early years of the 1900s. And this really changed the nature of work. People became part of the machines in many ways, and it was the beginning of a long process that we call alienation or dehumanizing. But the IWW, in many ways, tried to get around that. They turned their back on mainstream unionism that Sam Gompers had embraced, and they tried to use the new thousands of people who were on the production line. And so they had sit-down strikes, they had slowdowns, they had picket lines with thousands of people involved. They mobilized women and children and different people that had been left out of the labor movement for many years. So they had great success with it, but it would be another 20 years before we saw that really come into its own. Another ironic impact that the Wobblies would have because of their militancy and their radical tactics was the fact that compared to Sam Gompers and the AFL, it made Gompers look like a real statesman. Employers, in many instances, were now more than willing to sit down with Gompers and the different crafts in the AFL, under the AFL umbrella, and negotiate with them. Of course, this is something that Gompers had been wishing for a long time, to get that respectability from the other side. And who would have ever thought that it was the IWW so much to the left that it pushed Gompers right into the middle and made him look like a person that the employer could indeed work things out with all at once. But the Wobblies, and we're not quite done with them yet, but they did leave a legacy of and an impact on things like singing, theater, oratory. A lot of this came from the immigrant groups themselves, of which there were many around that time period of 1900, right up until World War I, when most immigration stopped altogether because of the combatants. But there is another IWW case that we want to look at just very quickly, only because you've probably heard this guy's name a few times. His name was Joe Hill, and his real name was Joe Hillstrom, and he was an immigrant from Sweden. He was often referred to as labor's troubadour. That is someone who could go out and sing, and he could even be a comedian when he had to be. And Joe became the songwriter for the IWW. He went all over the country making up lyrics and singing in his own inimitable fashion. And he would often take songs that, say, the Salvation Army used or some established church sang at the cathedral on Sunday, and he'd keep the melody, but he'd change the words. And he took one of the Salvation Army songs and turned it into a new song, which he called Hallelujah, I'm a Bum. And of course, the IWW represented transient workers out west, hobos, people who rode the rails. And so in many respects, he was simply reflecting his own membership. And Joe Hill was also the one who gave us what we today consider labor's anthem. It was a poem written by a man named Ralph Chapin, and Joe Hill turned it into Solidarity Forever. And you can't go to a union conference or a union gathering these days without somebody getting up with a guitar and singing that song. And don't worry, I'm not going to try to imitate any of those people who do that singing. You can get a hold of a tape and enjoy it for yourself. Anyway, Joe Hill, who, as I mentioned, traveled the breadth of the country on his work for the IWW, made one fateful stop in 1912 and 13 and 14. He was in and out of Utah, which did not have a reputation of being very hospitable to union organizers, and I would guess probably even to this day. But Joe Hill happened to be, and we can only think this was another one of these frame-ups that the authorities used against labor activists and organizers. Joe Hill, who I don't think had a mean bone in his body, was arrested for the alleged holdup of a hardware store in the capital of Utah. And it created not only a national stir, but an international one. People demonstrated throughout the capitals of Europe. Sweden, about 25 years ago, put out a commemorative stamp in remembrance of Joe Hill. This was a real cause that a lot of people sank their teeth in. And the IWW, in many ways, tried to resuscitate or bring back its enthusiasm and activity through the case of Joe Hill. Hill at first put on a very vigorous defense. The eyewitness reports really didn't describe Joe Hill at all. The sketches that they took from the eyewitnesses didn't look like Joe Hill. It seemed like just another frame-up. But somewhere along the way, Joe Hill got it into his head that by playing the role of a martyr, as many of these people did, that he could do more for the IWW and the labor movement by almost offering himself up as a sacrifice, as someone who would give his life to labor and his fellow men and women in order to advance their cause. And he just shut it all down. He wouldn't fight anymore. He just figured he'd be executed, and with that, he would help reinvigorate the IWW and the goal of workers. The case became so widespread and so well known that President Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, actually telegraphed the governor of Utah, and I won't say he begged, but he almost pleaded with him to not execute Joe Hill, that they were on the edge of World War I, that they did not want to do anything to antagonize American working people, but the governor of Utah held his line. Now, Joe Hill, as I mentioned, was not only a songwriter, but he had that comic sarcasm that we sometimes see in people like that. And the night before his execution, he would say to the press, "Tomorrow, I expect to take a trip to the planet Mars, and if so, will immediately organize the Mars Canal Workers into the IWW, and we will sing the good old songs so loud that the learned stargazers on Earth will once and for all get positive proof that the planet Mars really is inhabited." We know it's not inhabited now, but they weren't so sure then. Joe Hill went on and he said, and he got much more serious, "I have nothing to say for myself, only that I have always tried to make the Earth a little better for the great producing class, and I can pass off into the great unknown with the pleasure of knowing that I never in my life double-crossed a man, woman, or child." And the next day he went to his execution. And in those days, and for places that maybe still do this, they may choose 5 or 6 prison guards or militiamen, and several of them will be given rifles with live rounds in them, and several others will get them with blank cartridges, so no one really knows who does the actual execution, so you don't have to live the rest of your life thinking that you killed somebody else. Just before Joe Hill was shot to death, he said perhaps his most famous words, and you'll see this time and again wherever you find labor people. He said, "Don't mourn me, organize. Don't mourn me, organize." And those words, uttered just a few minutes before his imminent death, really had a tremendous impact and would long outlive Joe Hill himself, although his memory was commemorated in all kinds of different ways over the years, and he's still remembered for his martyrdom. By the way, I might point out that when he was shot by the soldiers, they used dum-dum bullets. For those of you who know a little about military hardware, dum-dum bullet was an early example of those kind of hollow lead bullets that when they pierced you, they exploded. And when they did that, it simply destroyed your insides. And so that's what brought Joe Hill down, kind of a uncivilized way to kill a person who everyone's pretty sure was innocent. But as I said, Joe Hill went down as a martyr. He refused, and the IWW refused to mourn or bury him in Utah. They took him to Chicago, and 30,000 people lined the funeral route to pay homage to this martyr of labor. Now, as the IWW was definitely backpedaling, particularly after the incidents in New Jersey and the execution of somebody so prominent like Joe Hill, even though it did have its enervating moments to get people more involved, we find that all of these events, the Bread and Roses strike, the walkouts in New Jersey, the execution of Joe Hill, all took place in the shadow of a forthcoming World War I. And this was the greatest conflagration that the world had ever seen up to that point. Of course, until we get to World War II, and that supersedes it, even then a generation later. But there's a very strong quintessential labor question involved in this particular conflict. As I mentioned earlier, the IWW, because of its extreme activism and left-wing politics, often allied with Eugene Victor Debs's Socialist Party, made Sam Gomper's and all the craftsmen that he represented, whether it was iron workers or mechanics or bricklayers and carpenters and so many other skilled workers, it made them look more acceptable in the eyes of the public and at the negotiating table. And one thing we know about the United States government, war and labor, and that is the authorities do not want any interruptions whatsoever in the production process when we go to war, because materiel, the production process itself, the transportation of those goods to the war front are essential to victory, almost as important as the soldiers themselves who have to fight these awful conflicts. And so, in many ways, the government made the decision long before we entered the war, because remember, the war starts in Europe in 1914, but America doesn't enter until 1917, almost at the end. And we still suffered about 50,000 casualties in a simple 6 months. Hard to believe. But the government immediately took the side in 1914 of the Allied powers, England, France, and a whole host of smaller European nations. And by doing that, they joined that alliance, even more so than they did militarily, by providing financial assistance, by providing tanks and weapons and small arms to those Allied forces fighting in that terrible trench warfare over in Europe. And so after 6 months or a year, we were so involved in the war, not militarily, but financially, that we couldn't have extricated ourselves if we wanted. And so we became part and parcel of that alliance. Now, the irony was, of course, is that a lot of working people were not in favor of that war. And when you think about it, the largest ethnic groups in America at that time were the Germans and the Irish. The Germans, of course, had a little sympathy towards the old home country, and the Irish had no sympathy at all towards their longtime enemy, Great Britain. So you had a built-in constituency that was against the war from the beginning. And because of that, the government, fearing who knows what, maybe some type of backlash politically, or riots in the street, or breakdown in the production process, did whatever they could to placate labor. Now, this is one of the first times that we see the authorities intervening in the labor management process. It's very unusual. But the U.S. government created the War Labor Board, which was set up to look at labor strife, labor conflict, and try to prevent strikes and walkouts. And the War Labor Board was made up not only of management and government people, but also labor and others who were sympathetic to the cause of working people. And so in order to keep people quiet on the assembly line and making sure they still went to work, the government reimbursed management for whatever their labor costs were. And lo and behold, Sam Gompers seized that opportunity to put the American Federation of Labor strongly in the camp of the war. Very different from the IWW, which, while they stayed neutral between the Allies and the forces of Germany and initially Italy, still had no love for management, and they kept going on strike, much to the chagrin, of course, of the U.S. government, who had less control over them than, let's say, the AFL and Gompers' willingness to play ball, so to speak. And so we discover that in those war years, particularly before we got into the war in 1917, the labor movement, as represented by Gompers and the AFL, was able to achieve certain wages conditions and benefits that they had sought for 25 years and been turned down. The government overturned one of the pieces of legislation which had been used against labor in the Pullman strike way back in 1894. It was supposed to be used against corporations. It was only used against labor. They overrode it. And when the War Labor Board began to make its decisions, we discover that hefty raises were given to labor people. Maybe finally the coffee break, although I always think that's been there for hundreds of years, maybe a tea break. But we finally got a few minutes off between lunch and breakfast and supper. And maybe time and a half after 8 hours, or time and a half on weekends. These were tremendous breakthroughs in personnel relations. So much so that after the war, we wouldn't see them again for another generation. Although working people certainly applauded the fact that things got better. It was a very different story once the war was over. And so as we look at those years, 1914, 15, and 16, before America enters, we discover that working people make a tremendous stride forward. But they do so at a cost, because in some ways they embrace a war that really wasn't in everyone's best interest. Too often we look at World War I through the prism of World War II. Nothing could be further from the truth. World War I was about empires. It was about colonies. It was about the old European powers holding on to what they had taken so many centuries earlier. Now you have a couple of new kids on the block, Germany and Italy, the last two major countries to become countries in Europe, trying to catch up with the other neighbors. And in so doing, that's how we end up in World War I. But it's very different than World War II. But I will say that because of the harsh peace treaty after World War I, that would lead eventually and directly to World War II. So the next time we get together, we'll see how America enters the war towards the end of it in 1917, and then the Red Scare, which will really do a number on labor right after that.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen 3 times each week: Tuesdays at 7 p.m., Thursdays at 8 p.m., and Saturdays at 5 p.m.